My name is Anna Carter, and for most of my life I believed I was destined for nothing but ordinary struggles. My days blended into each other like shades of gray, filled with routine, exhaustion, and a quiet kind of despair. I woke up every morning in a small rented apartment with peeling wallpaper and creaking floors, brewed a cup of bitter coffee that barely kept me awake, and dragged myself to a job that felt less like work and more like punishment. I lived in a cycle of survival. The money I earned was never enough. Rent consumed half my paycheck, bills ate the rest, and groceries were bought with whatever remained. Sometimes I skipped meals just to make sure I could cover the basics. Other times I counted the coins in my wallet, trying to stretch them until the end of the week. My life became a constant calculation of what I could live without. The loneliness made everything worse. Evenings were silent except for the hum of the refrigerator or the static from the television I kept on, just to drown out my thoughts. I would sit by the window, staring at the city lights, and imagine a life that wasn't mine. A life with comfort, with freedom, with choices. In those private moments, I let myself dream of a bigger apartment, of being able to buy something without checking the price tag, of traveling somewhere just because I wanted to. But deep down, I always knew those were only dreams. Work brought no escape. The hours dragged endlessly, and each day felt like a repetition of the one before it. I was invisible there, just another name on a payroll, a replaceable part of a machine that didn't care if I was exhausted, broken, or hopeless. I often caught myself wondering if anyone would even notice if I disappeared. Despite all this, I tried to convince myself that my life was fine, that I had enough, that I should be grateful. But the truth gnawed at me every night. I was not living, I was simply existing. The world kept moving forward while I stood still, trapped in the same worn-out routine. And then it happened. The event that shattered the monotony and forced me onto a path I never expected. A letter arrived, one I almost threw away because it looked like junk mail. Inside that envelope was the beginning of everything, the secret that would change my life forever. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. My hands trembled as I read the words, and by the time I reached the end, I realized that the world I thought I knew was gone. I had inherited something far bigger than I ever imagined. It wasn't just money, it was a burden. And in that moment, without even realizing it, I stepped into a story that would alter everything I thought I knew about myself, my family, and the fragile illusion of trust. When I opened the letter, my life instantly split into before and after. At first, it looked completely ordinary, an envelope mixed in with bills and advertisements that I usually grabbed from the mailbox without much thought. I could have easily thrown it away without even opening it, but something made me stop. The paper was heavier than usual, the handwriting on the envelope neat and formal. I tore it open, expecting nothing special, and froze. It was a letter from a law firm informing me that I had become an heir. A man whose name I vaguely remembered from my parents' rare stories had passed away, and he had left me a vast fortune. The numbers on the page didn't make sense. I reread every line again and again, trying to convince myself it wasn't a mistake, that the letter really was addressed to me. At first there was numbness. My mind couldn't accept that someone like me, an ordinary woman worn down by debts and routine, had suddenly been handed the chance to live an entirely different life. I had always dreamed of freedom, of not counting pennies, of not denying myself small joys. But when that dream suddenly materialized, I didn't feel joy. I felt fear. The whole day passed as if in a fog. I folded and unfolded the letter dozens of times, memorizing every word. I imagined quitting my job, renting a different apartment, buying clothes I had always walked past without daring to stop. For a short time, I felt a strange, intoxicating lightness, as though I stood at the threshold of a new life. But the more I thought about it, the stronger my anxiety grew. The money didn't feel like a gift. It felt like a heavy burden. I imagined the faces of my family if they ever found out the truth. Every question would seem suspicious, every request for help a test of loyalty. I feared that I would no longer see them as family, and they would no longer see me as a person, only as a sum of money. That evening, lying in the dark, I realized that I had become the keeper of a secret that could change everything. I couldn't share it with anyone, not even with those closest to me. This secret had to stay buried inside me, or it would destroy everything I had left. I convinced myself that silence would protect me, that it was the only way forward. But even that night, I felt it for the first time. Silence doesn't always save you. Sometimes it is the very thing that begins the end. The days that followed felt unreal, as though I were walking through a dream that no one else could see. On the surface, nothing had changed. I still woke up in the same small apartment, still drank the same bitter coffee, still dragged myself to work where every hour felt like an eternity. But beneath that thin layer of routine, everything inside me was different. I carried the letter everywhere, folded neatly in my bag, as if keeping it close would make it less frightening. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, I would sneak into the bathroom at work just to unfold it, to stare at the numbers printed on the page, to remind myself it was real. Each time the shock hit me again. It wasn't a fantasy. It wasn't a dream. I had money, more than I ever thought I would see in a lifetime. But instead of freedom, I felt the heavy chains of secrecy wrapping tighter around me. Every conversation at work became unbearable. When a colleague asked how I was doing, I panicked, wondering if they somehow knew. When someone mentioned money or complained about bills, my chest tightened, and I had to force myself not to flinch. I became hyper-aware of every word, every glance, as if the secret was written across my face for everyone to read. At night, my imagination became my worst enemy. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining how my family would react if they discovered the truth. I pictured their smiles turning sharp, their words laced with demands. Would they see me as a daughter, a sister, a friend, or only as a wallet? And what if word spread further? Strangers, neighbors, even people I barely knew might start circling like vultures. I told myself that silence was safety, that if no one knew, no one could hurt me. But the silence came with a price. It built walls between me and the people I loved. I found myself holding back in conversations, avoiding questions, avoiding closeness. My relationships, once fragile but real, began to feel strained and distant. One evening, sitting by the window with the city glowing outside, I realized I no longer belonged to the life I had before. I had money now, yes, but I couldn't spend it freely without raising questions. I couldn't confide in anyone. I was trapped between two worlds, the one I came from and the one I was too afraid to enter. The inheritance was supposed to be a gift. Instead, it was like a shadow following me everywhere, a constant reminder that nothing in life comes without a cost. The weight of it pressed down on me more heavily with each passing day, and deep inside, I began to feel that my decision to keep it hidden was not protecting me at all. It was isolating me, slowly consuming the person I used to be. And even though I didn't know it at the time, keeping the secret would soon draw me into choices and situations I could never take back. The silence I wrapped around myself was supposed to be a shield, but with each passing week it began to feel more like a prison. The walls of secrecy grew taller, and I could no longer see beyond them. At first, I convinced myself that this isolation was necessary, that protecting my secret meant protecting my future. But the longer I lived in that cage of silence, the more suffocating it became. I started noticing how detached I was becoming from the people around me. My coworkers would share stories about their families, laugh over trivial inconveniences, and complain about bills or rent. I would nod, smile faintly, but inside I felt an ever-expanding void. I wanted to say, if only you knew what I carried inside me, if only you understood how everything had changed. But of course, I never said a word. To do so would shatter the fragile protection I clung to. At family gatherings, the distance grew even more unbearable. Sitting at the same table with my relatives, listening to their worries and frustrations, I felt like an imposter. They spoke of debts, of uncertain futures, of sacrifices they had to make just to keep going. And there I was, holding the key to answers, the means to ease their suffering. Yet I remained silent. Each moment of laughter or complaint felt like a dagger twisting inside me. I told myself I was doing it for their own good, that money would only poison relationships, but deep down I knew it was also fear. Fear of losing the image they had of me, fear of being reduced to nothing more than what I possessed. Nights became the worst. When the world went quiet and there were no distractions, I was left alone with the weight of my choice. I would sit in the dark, staring at the folded letter, wondering how a single piece of paper could hold so much power over me. My mind raced with endless what ifs. What if someone found out by accident? What if a slip of the tongue gave me away? What if the very thing I believed would secure my future ended up destroying the fragile life I had built? I realized then that the inheritance was no gift. It was a test of character, of trust, of how far I could go without breaking under the pressure of secrecy. And though I wanted to believe I was strong enough, cracks were already forming. I began to withdraw from those I loved, avoiding questions, avoiding their eyes. Each smile I forced felt hollow, each conversation rehearsed. The money had created a barrier that no one else could see, but I felt it every moment of every day. It stood between me and the people I cared about, between me and the life I once knew. I thought I was keeping them safe, but in truth, I was losing them piece by piece. The loneliness grew louder than any fear, and I could feel myself slipping into a life where trust no longer existed, where connection was nothing but a distant memory. And somewhere deep inside, I began to sense that this silence I clung to would not last forever. Secrets always have a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully they're buried. The only question was, what kind of damage would be left when mine finally came to light? The weight of the secret began to spill over into every corner of my life, poisoning moments that once seemed ordinary. I thought I could carry it quietly, tucked away like a hidden stone in my pocket, heavy but invisible. Instead, it grew until it pressed against my ribs, stealing the air from my lungs. One evening, as rain tapped relentlessly against my window, I found myself sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by unopened bills. Rent was due, electricity was past due, and the notice from the credit company threatened legal action if I didn't pay soon. I stared at the papers, knowing that I had the means to erase all of it with a single transaction, yet the fear of revealing too much chained my hands. What excuse could I offer if suddenly every debt vanished overnight? How would I explain my sudden stability when everyone knew how precarious my life had been? I told myself that being careful was wise, that patience would protect me. But my patience was quickly turning into self-destruction. I began skipping meals to stretch what little money I allowed myself to use. I wore the same worn-out clothes to work, pretending it didn't matter, when in truth every thread felt like a reminder of the prison I had built around myself. I had riches in silence and poverty in reality. The contradiction gnawed at me like hunger that never eased. It was during this time that my sister, Elena, came to me in tears. Her husband had lost his job, and they were struggling to cover basic expenses for their children. She sat in my kitchen, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped mug of tea, her eyes red with exhaustion. Every word she spoke cut into me deeper than the last. She needed help, not just financial, but emotional, a reminder that family meant standing together. I listened, nodding, offering her comfort, but inside I was breaking, because I could have fixed everything. I could have paid her rent, stocked her fridge, given her children new clothes, and she would have never had to cry in my kitchen again. Yet all I could do was hand her a small amount of cash from my wallet, an amount that barely covered groceries for a week. She thanked me as though I had given her the world, and the gratitude in her voice shattered something inside me. That night, when I was alone again, I sobbed until my chest hurt. The money was supposed to free me, but instead it shackled me in chains I had forged myself. I was terrified that if I gave too much, too suddenly, the truth would spill out, and I would lose everything: my privacy, my family, my sense of self. And yet, by holding back, I was betraying the very people I claimed to love. Work became unbearable. My boss scolded me for mistakes I rarely made before, my focus slipping as the pressure of my secret consumed me. Coworkers whispered about how pale I looked, how distracted I seemed, and though they didn't know the reason, I could feel suspicion growing in their stares. I started dreading every interaction, convinced that somehow they could see through me, that the truth was written across my face like ink bleeding through paper. I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, my mind replayed the same images. My sister crying in my kitchen, my father's tired voice on the phone asking if I was doing okay, my own reflection in the mirror looking hollow and unfamiliar. And beneath it all was the constant whisper, "You could change everything, but you choose not to." One weekend, the breaking point came. I received another letter, this time from the law firm, reminding me that the inheritance was safely secured in my name and that I could begin accessing portions of it whenever I wished. They even offered assistance with discreet financial planning, assuring me everything could be managed in a way that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. I read those words again and again, my hands trembling. Discreet, secure, controlled. They were offering me exactly what I had been terrified of losing, but instead of relief, I felt dread, because it meant I had no excuses left. The wall I had hidden behind, my fear of exposure, was crumbling. The money wasn't just sitting there. It was waiting for me, demanding I make a choice. That night, as the rain fell harder, I understood something terrifying. My secret wasn't just mine anymore. It was starting to affect everyone around me. My family was suffering, I was unraveling, and the fortune that was supposed to be a blessing was turning into a curse. And the longer I held it inside, the closer I came to destroying not just myself, but everyone I cared about. After weeks of torment, I finally convinced myself that I had to act. The inheritance was real, the money was mine by law, and if I continued to live as though nothing had changed, I would collapse under the weight of my own hypocrisy. I told myself that using just a small part of it, quietly, carefully, couldn't possibly harm anyone. No one had to know the truth, not even my closest family. The first step was terrifying. I contacted the law firm, my voice trembling as I arranged a private consultation. Their office was in the city, a towering glass building that seemed to belong to another world, a world of polished shoes, expensive perfumes, and people who had never worried about a late utility bill. Walking through the lobby, I felt like an intruder, a ghost among the living. In the attorney's office, everything smelled of leather and polished wood. He spoke calmly, reassuring me that everything could be managed discreetly. "We can create accounts under specific trusts," he explained. "You'll have access to funds without your name being directly attached in ways that draw attention." His words should have been comforting, but instead, they made my heart race faster. Every promise of secrecy reminded me of how much I had to hide. I walked out of that office with trembling hands clutching a folder full of documents. Inside, I had instructions for accessing a small portion of the inheritance, enough to erase my debts and breathe for the first time in years. It should have felt liberating, but when I finally sat in my apartment and stared at the folder, I froze. Hours passed. I paced the room, opened and closed the folder, imagined every possible consequence. What if someone noticed? What if Elena or my father asked how I suddenly managed to get back on my feet? Eventually, exhaustion won over fear. I followed the instructions and transferred a modest sum into my personal account. Not millions, not enough to raise suspicions, just enough to cover rent, bills, and groceries. Watching the numbers change on the screen made my head spin. For the first time in months, I wasn't suffocating under overdue notices. For the first time, I could breathe, but peace didn't come. Instead, paranoia seeped into every thought. I imagined eyes following me when I walked to work, imagined coworkers whispering not about my pallor but about my bank balance. Even when I bought something as simple as a new coat, nothing extravagant, just warmer than the threadbare one I had worn for years, I felt like I was betraying my secret. The cashier's glance seemed too curious, the silence too heavy, as though the world had noticed my sudden change. I thought I could hide in plain sight, but hiding became harder each day. At a family dinner, Elena mentioned casually that I looked healthier, less tired, as though some unseen weight had lifted. Her words, meant as kindness, hit me like an accusation. My father's eyes narrowed slightly, and though he said nothing, I imagined the questions forming in his mind. At night, the fear grew unbearable. I woke from dreams where people ripped open my walls and found the folder, the bank transfers, the truth. I would jolt awake drenched in sweat, convinced that someone, somewhere, had already uncovered everything. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that no one could possibly know, but the fear never left. The irony was suffocating. I had money to free myself, yet every coin felt like another chain. I used it to escape debt, but in doing so, I bound myself tighter to the silence that was destroying me. The more I tried to move forward, the more I felt like I was sinking into a pit with no way out. Then came the moment that shattered the fragile balance I had built. One morning, as I walked into the office, my boss handed me an envelope. Inside was a notice. I was being considered for a promotion. The raise was significant, enough to ease financial strain without dipping further into the inheritance. For anyone else, it would have been a blessing. For me, it was a curse. Because I couldn't accept it without questions being asked about my recent stability. Why was I suddenly out of debt? How had I managed so well when just weeks before I was drowning? I smiled weakly, thanked him, and retreated to the bathroom, where I locked myself in a stall and shook uncontrollably. Opportunities were appearing, doors opening, but all I felt was dread. Every step forward threatened to expose me. Every blessing looked like a trap. By the time I returned home that evening, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how carefully I tried to control it, the secret was unraveling me. And sooner or later, the silence I thought was protecting me would collapse, burying me beneath the truth I was so desperate to hide. The first cracks in my carefully constructed silence began to show within my family. I had convinced myself that as long as I remained cautious, spending only small amounts, blending into the life I had always lived, no one would notice. But people notice more than we imagine, especially those who have known us our whole lives. It started with Elena. She had always been observant, the type to pick up on small details others missed. One evening, while we were sitting in her living room, she glanced at my coat and shoes. They were new, modest, but new, and I saw her eyes linger for a second too long. She didn't say anything, but I could feel her unspoken question hanging in the air. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I replayed that glance over and over, convinced she already suspected something. My father noticed changes too, though his observations came in subtler ways. He asked if work had given me a raise, if perhaps I had found a second job. His questions were wrapped in casual curiosity, but to me they felt like knives. I gave vague answers, deflecting, pretending that nothing had changed, but I could see in his eyes that he wasn't satisfied. My silence was beginning to draw more attention than the truth ever could. I started shrinking from them, avoiding long conversations, inventing excuses not to visit as often. When I did go, I forced myself to wear my old clothes, deliberately choosing the things I had once been ashamed of. I even kept my old handbag, its straps fraying, as though it were a costume I put on to hide behind. The absurdity of it ate at me. I had the means to live comfortably, yet I clung to scraps out of fear of being discovered. But the problem with fear is that it magnifies everything. Soon, I began to imagine suspicion even where there was none. A passing comment from a cousin felt like an accusation. A laugh from a coworker felt like mockery. Every glance, every pause in conversation became a threat. My paranoia grew so large that it overshadowed reality, leaving me trapped in a constant state of alertness. The guilt was even worse. Watching Elena struggle broke me more with each passing day. I saw her children wearing hand-me-down clothes, shoes too small for their growing feet. I saw the lines of exhaustion deepening on her face, and every time I looked at her, I remembered the fortune sitting untouched in accounts with my name on it. I could change her life in an instant, yet I remained silent, choosing secrecy over love. That silence hollowed me out until I could barely recognize the person I had become. I stopped sleeping again. Nights turned into long, torturous vigils where I stared at the ceiling, imagining every possible outcome of exposure. I imagined Elena's face twisted with betrayal, my father's voice cold and distant, my family breaking apart under the weight of what I had hidden from them. I imagined the inheritance transforming from a blessing into poison, seeping into every relationship until nothing remained but suspicion and resentment. At work, I forced myself to act normal, but the stress showed. My hands trembled when I typed, my mind drifted during meetings, and my colleagues whispered when they thought I couldn't hear. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew my behavior was drawing attention. The promotion offer still sat unanswered, a silent reminder that even opportunities now felt like traps. I tried to convince myself that things could still be controlled, that if I remained careful, if I stayed silent just a little longer, everything would stabilize. But deep inside, I felt the ground shifting. Secrets have weight, and mine was growing heavier every day. The fortune I had hidden wasn't just money, it was a storm, and I could already hear the thunder rumbling in the distance. I understood then that silence doesn't protect forever. It only delays the inevitable. And as much as I tried to bury the truth, I knew one day it would claw its way to the surface, leaving behind devastation I could no longer control. The crisis came faster than I had feared. Secrets always wait for the right moment to turn against you, and mine chose a day that began as unremarkably as any other. It was a Saturday morning, cold and damp, and I had decided to run a few errands. For the first time in months, I allowed myself a small indulgence. I walked into a boutique, not an extravagant one, but certainly nicer than the second-hand shops I usually pretended were all I could afford. I told myself I deserved something decent, something that might remind me I was still alive and not just existing inside the prison of my own silence. I bought a dress. Simple, elegant, not flashy, yet far too expensive by the standards of the life everyone thought I was living. Carrying the bag home, I already felt the sharp edge of guilt cutting into me. I promised myself I'd wear it rarely, only on special occasions, and even then I'd be careful. But fate has a way of exposing what we most desperately try to hide. That afternoon, Elena stopped by unexpectedly. She needed to borrow some things, she said, and before I could refuse, she was standing in my apartment, scanning the space with her tired but perceptive eyes. I had done my best to keep everything looking modest, but the bag from the boutique sat on the chair where I had dropped it. It might as well have been a burning torch in the middle of the room. She noticed it immediately. I saw her gaze fix on the logo, saw the flicker of confusion pass over her face. She didn't ask about it, not directly, but she lingered near the chair a moment too long, her silence louder than any words. I quickly moved the bag, pretending it was nothing, mumbling something about a rare sale. She nodded, but I could feel her doubt hanging between us like smoke. After she left, I collapsed into a chair, my heart racing. It had been such a small thing, a harmless purchase, yet it threatened to unravel everything. I realized then how fragile my lie truly was. One slip, one glance, one unasked question could destroy the wall I had built. From that day on, paranoia turned into obsession. I became hyper-aware of every detail in my apartment, every item I bought, every receipt I kept. I began living like a fugitive in my own life, constantly rehearsing explanations for things no one had even questioned yet. My mind spun elaborate stories to justify every small change in my lifestyle, stories I might never need to tell, but which haunted me nonetheless. The irony was unbearable. I had wealth, yet I lived like someone under constant surveillance, terrified of being exposed. The money wasn't freeing me, it was watching me, controlling me, dictating every choice I made. The inheritance had become a shadow that clung to me, following me wherever I went, whispering in my ear that sooner or later I would slip. The breaking point came at a family gathering a week later. I wore the new dress. I had convinced myself it looked modest enough to pass without notice. But as soon as I walked in, I felt every pair of eyes on me. Compliments were given, kind words, admiring glances, but to me they were daggers. I imagined every smile hiding suspicion, every remark carrying an unspoken question. How could you afford that? Throughout the evening, I barely spoke. I sat stiffly, smiled when appropriate, laughed when necessary, but inside I was unraveling. When my father placed a hand on my shoulder and said I seemed different lately, happier, more confident, I almost broke down in tears. If only he knew the truth, that my confidence was a fragile mask, that beneath it I was terrified every moment of being discovered. That night, lying awake, I understood something I had been avoiding for months. The secret was no longer mine alone. It was beginning to seep into the lives of the people I loved, twisting interactions, poisoning trust. Every encounter carried a risk. Every gesture felt staged. The inheritance wasn't just haunting me anymore. It was haunting them too, even if they didn't realize it yet. I realized with a kind of cold clarity that this couldn't go on forever. Either I would confess, risking everything, or the truth would find its own way out, tearing through the silence I had built. And deep down I already knew which one was more likely. Secrets have a way of escaping, no matter how tightly we try to hold them. And when mine escaped, I feared it would destroy not only me, but the fragile bonds of family I was clinging to. I had always feared that the secret would slip from my own lips, that some careless word would betray me. But the truth is, secrets rarely stay hidden because of what we say. They escape through cracks we can't control, through people who see more than we want them to, through chance encounters that we never planned for. That was exactly how it happened to me. It began innocently, as so many disasters do. I had gone to the bank to sign a few documents related to the trust. The law firm had assured me that everything was discreet, shielded under layers of formality and confidentiality. Still, I never walked into that building without feeling as though I were stepping into enemy territory. Each glass wall a mirror reflecting back the guilty expression I couldn't erase from my face. On that day, as I sat with the manager reviewing paperwork, I caught a glimpse of someone familiar in the corner of my eye. At first I thought I was mistaken. It couldn't be. But when I turned my head, my stomach dropped. It was a family friend, an old acquaintance of my father's, a man who had known me since I was a child. He glanced at me briefly, then back at the teller, but I knew the image of me sitting in the private office of a high-end bank was already etched into his mind. I left as quickly as I could, heart pounding, but the damage was done. By the following weekend, whispers had begun to surface. My father called me, his voice careful, measured. He asked how I was, if everything was all right, if I needed help. But beneath his words, I heard it. The question he didn't dare ask directly. What were you doing in that bank? I tried to dismiss it, to assure him everything was fine, but paranoia tightened its grip. Every family gathering after that felt like a stage where I was the unwilling performer. My sister watched me too closely. My father's questions lingered too long. Even the children seemed to sense the tension, their innocent eyes darting between us, as if they could feel the silence pressing down on the room. The real breaking point came one evening when Elena came by unannounced. She had always been the one to show up without warning, but this time was different. She didn't bother with small talk, didn't ask how I was. Instead, she walked straight into my apartment, her eyes scanning the space like a detective searching for evidence. I followed her, my throat dry, my mind racing. She noticed the new furniture first, a small table I had bought after finally allowing myself to replace the old one that wobbled on uneven legs. Then her gaze fell on the shelves, where a few newer books had appeared, their crisp covers betraying the fact that they hadn't been pulled from a second-hand bin. She didn't say anything, but the silence was heavy, suffocating. When she finally spoke, her words were soft, but they cut sharper than any knife. You've changed. I wanted to deny it, to laugh, to wave it away, but my lips trembled, betraying me. I muttered something about saving carefully, about cutting back, but the excuses sounded hollow even to my own ears. Elena nodded, but her eyes told me she didn't believe me. That night, after she left, I collapsed onto my bed, shaking. The secret was no longer safe. It was bleeding into the world, visible in the smallest details I could no longer control. My inheritance, once locked away in silence, was now casting shadows that others had begun to see. I started living in constant panic. Every phone call felt like an interrogation, every visit like an investigation. I caught myself rehearsing lies in the mirror, building stories I might need if confronted directly. But no matter how carefully I prepared, I knew the truth had already slipped through the cracks. What haunted me most was not the fear of being exposed, but the fear of what would come after. Would my family see me as a liar? Would they accuse me of selfishness, of betrayal, of choosing money over love? Would everything we had left, our fragile bonds after years of hardship, shatter completely? For the first time, I realized that the inheritance had never been mine alone. From the moment I chose silence, I had entangled everyone I loved in a web they never agreed to enter. And now, as suspicion grew and shadows lengthened, I understood that I was standing on the edge of collapse. The secret was no longer a stone in my pocket. It was an avalanche, and it was beginning to fall. I always thought I could control the story, that if I was careful enough, clever enough, silent enough, the truth would stay buried. But secrets don't stay where you hide them. They grow, they breathe, they find cracks to escape through. And one evening, everything I had built around my silence collapsed in a way I could never have prepared for. It was a family dinner. Nothing unusual at first. Elena had insisted we all come together, as if sensing the distance widening between us. My father sat at the head of the table, older and quieter now, his once strong hands trembling slightly when he lifted his glass. The children ran in and out of the room, their laughter echoing down the hallway. For a while, it almost felt normal, almost safe. But I should have known. Suspicion had been circling me for weeks, and that night, it finally landed. Dinner was nearly finished when my father cleared his throat. His eyes found mine across the table, steady, searching. He asked, calmly, simply, about the bank, about the boutique, about the subtle changes he had noticed in my life. The words weren't accusatory, but they carried weight, the kind that comes from someone who already knows the answer but is waiting to hear it from you. Silence filled the room. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Elena set her glass down too hard, the sound sharp as breaking glass. I felt every eye turn to me, waiting. My pulse thundered in my ears, drowning out the children's laughter, the clinking of dishes, the ordinary sounds of family life. It was just me and their questions. I tried to speak, but the words tangled in my throat. My lips parted, yet nothing came. My father's gaze never wavered. Elena's eyes burned into me, and I felt like a criminal caught mid-crime. The excuses I had rehearsed in the mirror vanished from my mind. There was only the crushing weight of the truth pressing against my chest, demanding release. Finally, I whispered something meaningless about saving, about budgeting, about finally being careful with money. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew no one believed them. My father's jaw tightened. Elena's lips pressed into a thin line. They didn't need proof. The lie was written all over my face. And then it happened. Elena, her patience gone, stood and demanded to know where the money was coming from. Her voice shook, not with anger, but with something worse: betrayal. She spoke of my sudden changes, of the expensive dress, of the whispers she had heard from the family friend who had seen me at the bank. Every sentence was a blow, and I had no shield left to raise. I wanted to scream, to cry, to confess everything at once, but my silence had trapped me. The longer I hesitated, the more they filled the space with their own conclusions. Maybe I had borrowed from someone dangerous. Maybe I was hiding debts. Maybe I was involved in something shameful. With every unspoken second, their trust in me unraveled thread by thread. My father finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. He said he didn't care about the money. He cared about the truth. He said that whatever I was hiding, it was destroying me, and now it was destroying them too. His words shattered the fragile wall I had built. I felt the tears come, unstoppable, hot and bitter. The room blurred around me, the weight of months, years, of silence crushed down, and I realized there was no escape left. My secret had risen from the shadows, demanding to be faced. I couldn't protect it anymore, and I couldn't protect them from it either. That night marked the end of my silence. Not because I was ready to tell the truth, but because the truth had already begun to tell itself. The inheritance, the fortune I thought I could hide, had finally burst through the cracks, and the damage was already spreading. My family didn't look at me the same. The bond we once shared felt fractured, fragile, on the verge of breaking completely. As I lay awake afterward, staring at the ceiling in the darkness, I understood something terrifying. The secret hadn't just changed me. It had changed them too. Trust once broken doesn't return the same. And no matter what happened next, I knew nothing in our family would ever be the same again.